All right. Hello, and welcome back to the Vertical Stride, the podcast where we break down the principles for the beginner runner all the way to the professional. I am your host, Jack Wren, and we are going to get straight to who the guests are today. Returning after a fantastic debut last week is Brian Newman. Brian, the fan response was fantastic. I immediately got comments of, we need more Brian. And then everyone reached out and said, Brian is really well spoken. He's very articulate, very easy to listen to. And so, welcome back, Brian. How are you?
That really means a lot. Thank you so much. I'm doing wonderfully and excited to be back on the podcast.
Yeah, well, we are excited to hear more from Brian. And then joining Brian today is another college teammate of ours, another friend of ours. We have Logan Burns today. What I will say about Logan is there are few runners that I would put up there with who I respect as a runner as much as I respect Logan. Not only does he train smart, he is probably the toughest and gutsiest racer I have ever met. I remember making Logan a promise during his last year of school that if I ever found someone that raced as hard or as tough as he did, that I would let him know. And 6 years later, I have yet to let Logan know that. So hopefully, selfishly, that comes soon, but Logan, that day hasn't come. Go ahead and introduce yourself. What are you training for? Some running highlights, things like that.
As you said, my name's Logan. Great to be here. I've always been told I have a face for podcasts. I am training for the Indianapolis Marathon. I will be running at that race with Brian. I ran long distance, cross country, and track in high school, kept running club at university, and nowadays I just stick to road races, marathons mostly, but the occasional half marathon or 5K.
Nice.
And if I can add to that, since Logan is too modest to say it, he is also an All-American at the NERCA or club collegiate level. So I believe top 8 in the country at the 5K. So he's a very impressive runner.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Logan how accurately I remembered in the last episode. Did you break 15:20?
I ran a 15:25, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I knew you had gotten under 15:30. What have you done in the marathon to kind of give the people some perspective?
My PR in the marathon was a 2 hours, 39 minutes at the Richmond Marathon. Other than that, I mainly hover around like 2 hours, 50 minutes low for most marathons, but that can fluctuate a lot on the course. But yeah, I've run, I think, 7 marathons now, coming up on the
Okay.
8th.
And are you giving it a good PR shot at the Indianapolis Marathon?
Yeah, I've heard it's very flat, and yeah, this will probably be the best shot I've had at a PR, hoping to take a very serious training cycle this time around.
Awesome. Well, that tails perfectly for what we want to talk about today. We've spent a couple episodes talking a lot about easy running, building our base, building our aerobic capacity, which obviously you need in spades for the marathon. But, we talk about building that engine, and now we want to go in and we want to fine tune it. We want to make it more powerful. We want to make it more efficient. And so we are going to introduce the topic of workouts. Today's episode is going to focus on what different types of workouts are, what the different words mean, and then what is the training outcome that they're trying to accomplish. And so we're going to start with kind of some of the basic kind of introductory ones. These are like the first types of workouts that you're going to hear about, give you an idea of what they are, and then how to maybe implement them into your training, and then maybe some traps to avoid with them and how to do them effectively and efficiently. And so I do want to start with, and then we'll go to Brian first. Do you have a favorite type of workout?
Well, as a long distance runner, I'm a big fan of tempo runs. I think one of the things that I love the most about it is just the mental toughness that it requires. You start it and you think there is no way I can hold this pace for 20, 30 minutes, and the sort of grind as you turn out the miles, and more often than not you realize you can go a lot further than you think you can.
Yeah, and I love bringing up the mental part of that early because that's going to be a big component of our conversation about tempo runs. Logan, what about you?
I love a good tempo, but I'm going to go with the mile repeats. Just a classic. I still am a track guy at heart. So I think it also helps that usually the mile repeats for me come at the end of the training cycle. So it's a great opportunity to feel fast and just come in strong on the track.
Yeah, so we'll hopefully be able to come back to that, kind of talk about what sort of pace you hit those mile repeats for, and maybe
Mhm.
what category of workouts those fit into. But Brian, you mentioned tempos, and I think that's one of the most bread and butter, the really essential ones. And so I want to talk about tempo first. And so I'm going to go to Logan because something I didn't mention about Logan is Logan was the coach for our team before I became the coach for our team. And so I felt like I learned a lot from you, Logan, kind of watching how you developed our training cycle and our training plan. When you hear that word tempo, what does that mean?
As Brian kind of alluded to, it's a sustained workout. I think the rule of thumb is something like your 5K pace plus 30 seconds per mile,
Hmm.
something like that. Something you can sustain for 30 to 40 minutes if you have to. And yeah, it's just I kind of think of it as like cruising. So you're running pretty hard, but not like full out. Something it can maintain for 30 minutes.
Cool. Brian, you talked about that 20 to 30 minutes. We talked last week about kind of that relative perceived effort. If you had to kind of gauge it on a scale of 10, where would you put tempo on that scale?
Yeah, something in the realm of a 6-ish. Jack, I'd be curious to see if you disagree. I think a good gauge too, as we're thinking about our beginner runner, maybe trying to figure out how to gauge this. We talked last week. Easy run. Ideally, you should be able to hold a conversation, maybe sort of sing a tune, and tempo effort. You're probably not going to be able to maintain a conversation,
Yeah.
but I think you should probably still be able to sort of say, an occasional sentence. If you're chatting with a friend and, something like, hey, let's turn here, or, just sort of really brief, clipped, sentences like that. You should probably still be able to maintain that. That could be one gauge of, relative effort there.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on to that metric. And so, for context for everyone listening or everyone watching, these are two runners that are both significantly faster than me. So, for example, if I was doing a tempo run with one of them and they were just chatting while I'm fighting for my life, I should have enough breath to politely say, "Hey, Brian, shut up," or "Logan, stop talking," but definitely not a full on conversation. Logan, what do you think about Brian's kind of placement on the scale out of 10 of a 6?
I think that's pretty accurate. It's probably more of a 7 for me.
Hmm.
Yeah, just something where you're kind of getting up into the gears, like the some of the faster end of your speed, but yeah, not. I would say 7 at the most. 6 to 7 sounds great.
Yeah. I think a lot of the literature says around a 7. What I'm finding as I'm having these conversations with people is that people use the 1 to 10 scale differently. So for context, in my mind, I'm thinking of easy run as somewhere around 5, which seems weird that it's like, all right, I'm ignoring like half the scale. But it's not like your easy run is nothing. Like you still go out and you do it. And that maybe for me comes from maybe a little bit of implicit attachment to kind of heart rate scales. Um and so I tend to 7 to 8, but I think we're actually using a lot of the same idea of like I should be able to get a couple short sentences. I really love the could hold it for 30ish minutes. If I had to 40, I'm not going to enjoy it, but it's going to be great or not great, depending on how you want to look at it. You both talked about the sustained element of a tempo run. Logan, I remember when you took over as the person designing the workouts for us, you also introduced a version of tempos of like cruise intervals. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, is this kind of where yeah, I think, like, maybe, like, doing the 5 minutes on, 6 minutes on, and then yeah. So I kind of like this normally, like, a tempo, you would picture, like, I'm gonna run tempo pace for 20 minutes. So you're just running a tempo pace for 20 minutes, workout's over, you have the warm up, cool down, at the end of it. But, this would be more like breaking up that tempo into
Mhm.
chunks. So for example, instead of doing 20 minutes, you might do 6 minutes of tempo pace, then maybe like 2 minutes of jogging, 6 minutes of tempo pace, 2 minutes of jogging. It's just kind of a great way to practice changing gears. I liked it because I think, in sort of a way, it's kind of what you do in a long distance race. I think a lot of times you might kind of turn it on for a bit. Like maybe you're thinking, okay, I can catch this guy. Let me like pick it up a bit, move up, and then slow down a bit instead of just running the same pace consistently. Maybe that's just the way I race, but I always thought it was a good method. Maybe it's not like based off a person, but maybe you're thinking, okay, here's a downhill, here's a flat. Let me change gears for a little bit. And I think that's just always a great thing to have in your toolkit.
Yeah, I think that's a really invaluable perspective. I think so often racing gets focused on as what is the time goal, but we're really kind of hearing place goal out of you, which, ultimately that's what a race is. Not every course is the same. Brian, what do you think of the cruise interval? How do you feel like it compares to the longer sustained tempo? When would you maybe use one over the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think those are both like great tools to have in your toolkit. I think certainly if you're training for, a longer race, you want to make sure that you can kind of sustain, like hold that pace for a long period of time. And I also think it depends on your goals. So there's certain races where, all you really care about is running a certain time. And then, for that, maybe getting used to sort of staying really consistent with the time could be beneficial. If you're in high school cross country where, yeah, place really matters a lot and the time doesn't really matter, then I think getting used to changing the pace up a little bit, I think can be really valuable. So
Mhm,
just thinking about what the goals of your race are and how you can help use your workouts to help prepare you for that. And another thing that I'll add as far as, kind of gauging your effort, figuring out what this means, because our relative effort is, again, something like a 6 or a 7, this shouldn't be the kind of run where you finish and you're just collapsing, obviously you're going to be out of breath because you're working really hard, but you also ideally want to finish feeling like you could have gone further if you really needed to.
mhm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think you're both kind of taking the lens of a very experienced runner. And I do want to eventually come back to the role of tempo in marathon training. But let's consider our beginning runners for a moment here. What does maybe the cruise interval offer for the beginner runner that might be a little scary or daunting about the sustained effort of, hey, we're going out for 20 minutes to hold this? Logan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I always tell people, I think especially when you're like a new runner, you feel maybe a little self-conscious about taking breaks. I think especially if you're running for the very first time, there's no shame in that game in terms of taking like a walking break. Like maybe you're running 4 minutes, then you're walking 2 minutes, repeat, repeat. So I think this is definitely a little bit more easy than just saying, okay, you're going to run 70% of your speed for 20 minutes in a row. And it's a lot easier to visualize, to break it down into 6 minute chunks, and then practice that jog or even a walk if it's your first ever tempo. Nothing wrong with that. I think even the highest tier runners, especially coming back from an injury or a long break, will happily, do a similar sort of workout.
Yeah. Brian, do you implement the cruise intervals at all in your training?
I haven't recently, now that I'm like really thoroughly in marathon training, I feel like it's all been kind of sustained sort of longer efforts. But one thing I'll add as we're thinking about how, the beginner runner sort of approaching this for the first time is I'd say first of all, make sure that you've got the sort of easy runs down pat. Like I don't think you should jump into a workout, your first week of running ever. So I think before you tackle any of these workouts that we're going to talk about, I think you should get to the point where you're running at least several days a week. Your easy runs are feeling pretty good, and then you can start adding in some of this speed. And I think a tempo run, especially some of these cruise intervals where you're sort of getting some breaks, are a really great sort of gateway drug into workouts because the paces are a little bit easier than some of the intervals that we'll get to a little later. So I think this can be a great sort of first step into working out.
Yeah. Brian, I'm going to come right back to you. You talk about this is a type of workout. You have your easy run down, right? So we've been targeting our engine, we've been building our engine. And now, the analogy that we're using is we're fine tuning that engine. So, in what way is the tempo run fine tuning your engine? How is that helping you? What is the adaptation that this type of workout is going to help you develop?
Sure. So it's getting your body used to running faster paces for longer. And as Logan said, if you're training for a 5K, for example, tempo pace is not that. So I don't think that you can do only tempos and expect that you're going to set, an amazing 5K PR, for example. But you're getting the body used to sustaining a hard effort for, for a longer period of time, and getting your legs stronger, building your cardiovascular system in a way that's, like I said, a little bit less intense than some of the other workouts that we'll talk about later.
I think I do want to add the idea of about our body's ability to clear lactic acid
Yes, yeah, I wasn't sure when we were going to
and
get to that, but yes.
kind of the level of, all right, pushing at this effort where I'm able to kind of clear most of that lactic acid, so that nasty byproduct in our body that's making our muscles burn, making us feel tired, that everyone hates. And how can we kind of push what that level that we can tolerate without getting that buildup is? And so I think that's a really important part of tempo too. Kind of leads to, a lot of people also use that word threshold in kind of the same conversation with tempo, and kind of that which we can run fast without getting that accumulation of lactic acid. I want to go
Yeah,
back to marathon training,
can I build on that first?
of course.
I wasn't sure how scientific we wanted to get with this, but
Yeah.
yeah, to sort of provide a very sort of brief overview. When we're running, we're getting fuel, either sort of anaerobically or energy, either anaerobically or aerobically. So in other words, with oxygen aerobically or without oxygen anaerobically. The idea being when we're running a really easy pace, our body, the oxygen we're taking in is providing us with enough, materials to sort of create the energy that we need. As we get faster and faster, oxygen is sort of no longer able to do that, and so our body has to rely on breaking down glucose sort of inside our body to generate that energy, and that's what kind of creates a lot of that lactic acid. And so the faster you're going, lactic acid is building up, your body kind of can't clear it away. And this is not an on-off switch per se. The body is kind of always drawing from both of these simultaneously, but the faster you go, the more anaerobic things get, and therefore the more lactic acid that's going to sort of build up in the body. Runners often describe feeling a sort of burning feeling in the muscles when they're working out, and that's kind of what's happening there.
Yeah. So, I mean, and really working on, it's almost like a tolerance kind of a thing where, and you talked about it mentally. And so, I think these sustained tempo runs are great for building both kind of the mental capacity there, as well as helping your physical capacity. One last thing before we talk about, how you all might do this in marathon training. The cruise intervals are actually a good way to get a larger volume session at the same pace, right? So, the cruise intervals, Logan, you use the example of 6 minutes on, 2 minutes off. If you wanted to get 36 minutes of work at that tempo pace, the cruise intervals sometimes might be a better option, where you kind of break it up a little bit to get more work there than just trying to do a 36-minute straight tempo. Where, if we're talking about tempo being the pace that you can run for about 40 minutes, we're kind of approaching getting really close to an all out effort there. And so that's another benefit to the cruise intervals. And I don't know if the two of you kind of have a response to that idea
No,
either.
yeah, I think that's a great point. It definitely psychologically, I think if you are really trying to hit a time, say that's 6:30 pace, and you come in, you come in a little bit slow that first mile, and you're thinking, oh boy, I have to do another 30 minutes of this. I'm already off. Like you're starting to panic maybe. But if you're splitting it up into intervals and you have, maybe your first interval slow, then you get those 2 minutes to like reset, be like, all right,
Mhm.
have to go a little faster the next one. And then, maybe you can like right the ship.
Yeah. I think that's a really great and healthy way to approach some of those workouts, especially if you have those reps. Like, if the first one isn't what you want, you have an opportunity to fix it. And I don't know about you two, I find it harder to fix in a sustained effort than in a broken up effort. I don't know if that's how you feel, Brian.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. We'll talk more about this as we get into some of the other workouts, but I definitely agree. Going out too fast sometimes can can then wreck the entire workout. So and going out too slow sometimes can also kind of make it hard to calibrate that pace. So yeah, sometimes having a break that lets you sort of mentally and physically reset can be really beneficial.
Yeah. And so I did want to come back for marathon training because, in for 10K training, kind of depending on the level, tempo is going to be something that's slower than your race pace. especially if we're defining it as that 40-minute range. For 10K, that might be faster than what some people do, but it's usually kind of close. Marathon training and marathon pace is obviously going to be slower than what tempo pace is. And so, we talked mentally, it's kind of all right, getting used to running that faster pace for longer. What do you see, Brian, and we'll come back to you, Logan, after? What do you see as the role of tempo training in your marathon training cycle?
Yeah, so you're right. It's a really funny switch. Training for a 5K, the tempo is sort of a quote unquote slower pace. Training for a marathon, the tempo is a quote unquote faster pace. And what I find really helpful there is training for a marathon, you've got a goal pace. You do need to sort of get used to running miles at that pace so you know what it feels like. But it's also beneficial to know what it feels like to run faster than that. Because if all you ever do is run marathon pace, then marathon pace is going to feel really hard on the day.
Mhm.
If you get used to running, so let's say your marathon pace is, a 7 minute mile, and, maybe you do some tempo pace at 6:40. If your body is a little more used to 6:40, then all of a sudden, the day of your marathon, 7 minute pace doesn't feel quite as daunting. It's sort of providing, again, a little bit of a mental edge, but also a sort of physical edge of your body is prepared for more than you're asking it to do on race day.
Yeah. Logan, what about you?
Yeah, for me, the tempos are kind of the first workout I do in a training cycle. So after maybe 3 to 4 weeks of building up a base, just doing easy runs, getting more miles, maybe the occasional long run, the tempo is like kind of my first workout, and I think those start off at a slower speed and a shorter distance. So maybe my first tempo of the training cycle is 20 minutes at like say 6:30 pace or something. And then as you every week, maybe after two of those, then 3 weeks in to doing the workouts, now it's like 25 or 30 minutes, and it's 6:15 or six flat. I find it to great kind of ease into starting to do some workouts. It's kind of not so different from having maybe a faster run, which I like. And, I've never been a sprinter. So if I was going straight into doing like 400-meter repeats or something fast, which I'm sure we'll get into, that might be like too big of a gear shift for my body at that moment. So I like have the tempos to kind of ease into doing workouts.
How long into your cycle do you carry the tempo work?
I kind of do it for the beginning and the end. For me personally, a tempo is a low, maybe like low stress, low impact workout. So, like I said, it's great for the beginning. I'm not gonna probably pull something doing a tempo, and then at the end, it's a great, especially at the end once you're in like peak shape, approaching race day. It's like the great simulation for doing a race. Like all of a sudden now you're like, I can do a 5:30 pace or something for 20 to 25 minutes. And you're thinking, wow, I'm cruising. This isn't tough. It's a great confidence booster. So yeah, I think beginning of the training and the end.
I think another thing that's important to add here is because it's based on relative effort, it's going to be different depending on the day and depending on the sort of where you are in your training cycle. So, for example, if conditions are identical and you're feeling identically, then you're probably not going to have a huge jump from one week to the next week. But let's say one day is really hot and humid, the next week is
Yeah.
perfect conditions. That hot and humid day is going to be slower because that's what relative effort of 6 or 7 looks like on that day. And that's completely okay. Same thing with as your body gets more fit as the season goes on, your natural tempo pace might be a little bit different. And I think that's okay too. Don't be wedded to, well, I know my tempo pace is, 6 minutes or 7 minutes and I've got to hit that. It might look a little different depending on conditions and depending on how your body is progressing.
Yeah. And see, this is why we bring on the PhD as a guest, because just kind of full circle brought it back, relating it back to that relative effort, that idea of what could I hold for 30 to 40 minutes. And, Brian, again, is coming back to this idea that we talked about with easy running that, every day is different. The conditions are different. Something I like to say is, your watch and the timing and the pace are almost in a vacuum, but your body and how you feel misses nothing. Like your body doesn't miss that, hey, maybe I didn't eat that great today, or maybe I had a couple drinks last night, or it's really hot outside, or it's humid, or whatever else might be contributing to what affects that perceived effort. And so that's the biggest struggle that we have with the high school kids with tempo is they think it's a pace, not an
Yeah.
effort. And honestly, like it's kind of a range, right? So tempo might be, we've thrown out some examples in the sixes, for our beginner runner, like tempo might be somewhere from like 8:45 to 9:15. And sometimes it's actually better to work out at the slower end of that range so that you can do it for longer, right? And you'll get more of those adaptations and get more of that benefit and more of that change and more of that boost to your ability. And so I do want to thank the PhD for bringing that full circle for us. I do appreciate that.
Of course.
Yeah, this is why Brian gets invited back, and I get invited because my name sounds different enough from Brian. You always want to make sure you don't have the guest with a very similar name.
I mean, I think we mostly avoided catastrophe with the names last week. Jury's out. I think we got a couple good jokes out of it.
Yeah.
So I think it was all good.
I just wanted to jump off of something you said earlier, Jack. You're kind of talking about, I think even on the last episode, how like time can be kind of a trap for runners. Like you're maybe thinking, hit this time last week and now I'm not hitting it. And you're ignoring the fact that it is 20 degrees hotter, or you didn't sleep well, or you didn't eat well, or yeah, you maybe had a couple the night before. And I am, Brian's coming in. He's a wise guy. He's coming in with the science. He's got the PhD. I'll come in with the hot takes, get some engagement up, come at me in the comments. But I am so anti-time. I had a coach who was very anti-time. If we said that we got a PR in a cross-country race, he would come at us immediately and say, time does not matter in cross-country. Like, that course is not the same as the last course. And I've kind of always kept that internally. Like, I love having, a PR in the marathon, right? But is running like one marathon to another, there's so many hills, the temperature, the altitude, just the competition, it's all different. So I really just like to focus internally, even day to day, on how my body's feeling. So maybe you're running slower that day, but like, man, your body's really like putting in the effort. That's what
Mhm.
matters. It's not the times. You don't need to get the Strava record. You just got to work your body, and like you will be rewarded.
Yeah, I love that for so many reasons. The first is I feel like I do that contextualizing for especially high school athletes all the time. High school athletes, it's time, 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 which I get it. It's a number. You can latch onto it. You can identify it. It's a little more on the nose than, hey, was this a good effort? Did I feel good? Did I feel strong? And then I'll tell two kind of stories here that reminds me of, the year that you were coaching our team, Logan. We had one of the other nicest humans I have ever met, our friend Brandon. And I remember the two of you kind of getting into it a little bit. And he was like the president of our club, but you were the coach. And he was like ducking a hill in our tempo workout at the end. And like you were just like, what are we doing? Why are we avoiding the hill? We run hills in cross country. Like, I don't care that it's gonna take down your average workout time. Like, we have to get that work in. Kind of one of the few moments of like, hey, like, let's get it together. Like, let's remember what the goal is. Let's contextualize it. And then I think that would come up in both tempo runs and track workouts where, Logan, correct me if I'm misremembering places, but your fourth year, I'm pretty sure you were our fastest track 5K runner.
Yeah.
Yep. But we would go to tempo runs and, there's 2, 3, sometimes as many as 5 guys running their tempo run ahead of Logan, running their repeats ahead of Logan, probably overtraining. But then we would get to the race and it was never really that close. And so having the context of, what is the effort today? What is the goal today? I think is so important. And, I think as we move into some of our other workouts, we're really going to see that, hey, again, it's still that effort because the body misses no context. So,
And can I build on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to mention that. I was certainly guilty of that on a couple of occasions. I would run an interval workout with Logan, and I'll be honest, I had no place running an interval workout with Logan because he's a lot faster than me. It's so tempting, this desire to sort of win the workout or to feel like you have to push every workout as hard as possible. And that really is not the goal. The goal of the workout is to build fitness. And we've talked about ways that happens. But every workout, you shouldn't be trying to hit a home run. What you need is, a solid base hit, build some fitness every single time out there. And over the course of an entire season, you're going to get really strong and really fast.
Yeah. And, so you're coming back to what is the idea of that workout. We talked about the idea of the tempo run is kind of pushing that threshold, giving ourselves the mental edge and the mental fortitude to carry a sustained effort. We talk about in tempo runs not wanting to quote redline, right? And so that's a new term, a new phrase for us. And so it's really important for us to push kind of where that red line is. And the type of workout that we do for red line, right, and figuring out where that is, pushing it further is something that we call intervals. And so I'm going to go to Logan first. When you hear interval training or we are running intervals today, what's maybe an example of a workout that does that? And then what are you trying to accomplish? What is the relative effort? Give us all the good stuff.
Yeah, so intervals are kind of like maybe that next gear up. Like for me, that's like an 8 on like the speed, the 1 to 10 scale. If you're like a veteran runner, I kind of consider it 2 mile pace. That's a good rule of thumb. But even if you never have run a 2 mile, it's like like 80%. And this is where kind of what we're talking about with breaking up a tempo into chunks. These will be a similar kind of like a 7 to 8 minute chunk or like 6 to 8, something like that, where you're running at that 80% speed, and then you'll have like a longer break, like maybe it's 4 to 5 minutes of jogging, but yeah, you're just getting into that next gear and getting a little bit of a longer break so that you can prepare for the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you were training for non-marathon distances, were you approaching kind of 6 to 8 minute chunks of fast running, labeling that as intervals? Or is
Yes.
that kind of developed in your marathon training?
I think I was doing that long before the marathon. I think, yeah, like I think anything below that, you would be approaching maybe a faster speed. But I'd say like maybe 5 minutes is kind of the minimum amount of time I would consider like an interval pace of like 5 minutes sustained interval
Yeah.
pace. That
Okay. So
is.
I'm going to push you on that a little bit, Logan.
Mhm.
So you're trying, and I agree that, especially for someone around the caliber that you are, that intervals are about 2 mile pace. But let's face it, you were probably running 2 miles somewhere around 9:40, if not faster.
Right.
So you're telling me you're doing reps of 6 to 8 minutes at 2 mile pace?
Well, this is where we talk about the 80%, Jack. I have a much higher gear that I'm not using. But yeah, I will say it's been a while. But it's always, maybe it's a little bit slower than your 2 mile. But I just think that was a great rule of thumb. If you're like me and you have a lot of race experience, it's just like a good mindset to have.
Yeah, maybe we will come back and joust about the length of time about intervals and
Yeah.
and what we think. But I do want to give Brian a chance to jump in. What do you think with intervals, Brian? What do you like? What is maybe hard about doing interval workout training? Give us your perspective.
Yeah, well, I definitely think, as with all these workouts, the categories can be a little flexible. The definitions can be a little flexible depending on who's sort of defining it. I think an interval could be much shorter than that. I think you could do a 3 minute interval or a 4 minute interval. Yeah, I would agree with that sort of 2 mile ish pace, especially if you're shooting for more something like you're running 3 minutes on, for example, and then taking a break, or 4 minutes on. And yeah, the advantage there is you're really working on some of that faster speed. This is not an all out sprint. You're doing several of these, with some recovery, but you're really practicing, again, that sort of anaerobic speed. This is, your body cannot sustain this with just, the oxygen you're inhaling. So you're kind of getting your body used to these faster speeds that you might use in, a 2 mile race or a 5K race.
I think I tend to be a little more in that range that you described for intervals, Brian, of 3 to 5 minutes. And kind of that idea of, hey, I'm really kind of pushing and working at kind of my VO2 max, right? I'm really working there and I'm trying to spend time running at that effort where my heart is working that hard, where my lungs are working that hard. And, you all both said about 8. Sometimes I think that might even be as much of a 9. Again, this is where the scale gets a little weird because I'm kind of getting the feel that Logan, you're maybe thinking like, if I'm saying a 10 on the scale, I'm talking an all out sprint.
Absolutely.
But and then, kind of the perspective of like, all right, well, if I think about it as like a distance coach, I'm never really telling my kids to all out sprint that much in terms of when I'm giving them like perceived efforts. And so again, this is where the scale can get a little wonky. And so I do think kind of that gauge of 2 mile-ish speed, this is where I think we talk about effort. And if we wanted, we could give like heart rate percentages, and I will come back for that. But I think it's really important to, if you're not sure about some of these things, have a good solid resource to refer to. And for me, the one that I really like to refer to help me with pacing is going to be the Daniels running formula. This is not an ad. They are not paying me to have this on here for my 17 followers so far on Spotify. But the really nice thing that they have in here is based off of a result, they give pace recommendations. And so, you can go a little bit slower than those pace recommendations if the day calls for it. But it says, hey, we're going to take a result of what you did. And if you're doing this type of run, you should be at roughly this pace. Is that kind of something that you all use and encounter? Or do you go somewhere else for that pace metric?
Yeah, I definitely consulted that. I mentioned last episode that at first I was really trying to figure things out on my own, which did not always work out well. But
Yeah.
yeah, Daniel's book was one of the really foundational things that helped me figure this out. I'll also add, as we're thinking about these paces, trying to remain as consistent as possible, I think is really beneficial. I mean, again, if you're running this over hills, then the pace is going to be a little different. Assuming you're running on flat ground, let's say you're aiming for, let's just to make it easy math, let's say you're doing roughly half a mile in 4 minutes.
Hmm.
Now, it's much better to do that 4 or 5 times than to do, one interval in 340 and then the next is in 420 and the next is in 430. Again, the goal is not to hit a home run every workout, every rep. The goal is to sort of be consistent, do something that you can sort of sustain and repeat. So, yeah, I think trying to be consistent is beneficial there.
Yeah. Logan, what would be like your go-to interval workout when you were training for shorter distances and then now as you're training for marathons?
Yeah, I do think it was probably like that 5 minute range was great for when we were training for like 5Ks and 8Ks. So I think it was something, I think it's been a long time since I've done these workouts, but I think it was like a 5 minutes on, 3 minutes off at, yeah, interval pace. And yeah, I will also give a shout out to the Jack Daniels running formula. When I first started hearing about it and everyone was saying that, talking about Jack Daniels, I thought, man, these guys drink a lot. And, I'm coming in as an ignorant rube. I'm not as wise as our friend Brian here, but that is like the one running book that I have enjoyed and taken with me in my training.
Yeah.
Um,
I had a similar story when I took over after you kind of coaching our team, and my mom it was approaching Christmas time and my mom's like, "Hey, I'm like looking for ideas of things to get you." I'm like, "Oh, well, I want something called like the Jack Daniels running formula." And she's like, "I'm sorry, you want me to buy you what?" And like her mind went there as well. They have a section on marathon training in the Daniels running book. Do you all find that useful, or do you go other places when you're considering marathon training? And I'm going to go back to Logan here first.
yeah, I didn't really use it for the marathon, but I think the one thing I took away from it was sort of like the buildup that he
Mhm.
recommended. So, like, the way, maybe picture, like, a roller coaster. Like, as you're building up miles, like, that roller coaster's going up, and it reaches kind of a peak, and then you cut down. Like, you're not just constantly going up, up, up. That's not a fun roller coaster. So you're gonna go up and you're gonna go back down, go back up, go back down. So it's great I think he usually recommended like 2 to 3 peaks. And I thought that was a great way to make sure you didn't burn out. So I think that was, in my own experience, what I took away, where I was just looking at purely like, okay, what are the miles I'm hitting every week? Like I've gotten up a bit. I've been building up for a while. Let me cut down next week, get some rest before going back up.
Cool. Brian, where do you go to find some of your marathon training?
At this point, this will be my 7th marathon. I feel like I've got a system that's worked really well for me. I definitely consulted, Jack Daniels as I was training for my first one back in 2019. But I think now it's this rhythm of I know my body pretty well, and I know the kinds of workouts that have worked pretty well for me. So
Mhm.
just kind of listening to that and applying the principles that have worked in the past.
Yeah. So if you were trying to target some of those interval adaptations where you're working at kind of that maximum line, pushing that VO2 max, what's a go-to session for you?
Yeah, I think probably wouldn't do something quite as long as 8 minutes like Logan is saying, but maybe pushing it a little more like 5 minutes. I mean something like 6 by 5 minutes with a little bit of rest in between. I mean it's very hilly where I live, so the time doesn't always look great. So just trying to go
Yeah.
by effort.
Yeah, I think that 5 on, 3 off is a pretty common structure for intervals. I know we did a lot of 3 minutes on, 2 minutes off in college, which worked out, it kind of gives you that nice benchmark of, hey, like if we're running 6-minute pace, that's half a mile. Um, there's a decent amount of science that suggests one of the most powerful lengths of time to run in interval or repetition in running is that 3-minute mark, somewhere in there. And again, doing it for time, not necessarily distance. And then for, a beginner runner that's doing intervals for the first time, you know, even if you want to drop that down to like 2 minutes, I think the first couple times, even if you're an experienced runner getting back into a training block, the first couple times running intervals is kind of a shock to the body. And so it's nice to have kind of a gradual ease into that. If you have a little bit more time in the training cycle, you can. So if you have to do 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, that's fine. Maybe work it down to like 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. That can be a good workout as well. And I think something that's important with intervals is keeping the recovery at a point where when you start the next interval, you haven't completely recovered so that you get into that maximum effort range sooner in the interval. And now that's not to say that you go blow it out of the water in the first interval because you're going to end up sacrificing how much time you can actually go spend in that range. But like 5 on, 3 off is a great example. 3 on, 2 off is a great example. If you need kind of an easier, more intro one, then, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 1 minute off is great as well. I don't know if you all have other recommendations about maybe some intro interval runs.
No, I think that's a great point, Jack, and I love that you brought science on your side, the 3 minutes being the perfect amount. I think it's a great reminder. Maybe I should have opened with this that the people in this podcast are psychos, they're sickos. We are running more than the average person, the average runner. Don't take advice from a guy who's so sick in the head that he likes running marathons for fun. You don't have to be a marathon runner. You don't have to run my times to be a real runner. So always, like, yeah, take that 2 minute, make it a 2 minute interval with the 1 minute off or whatever. It's all about it's different for everybody. It's a beautiful thing about the sport. Anyone can do it. So just like listen to your body. If you're getting, if you're putting in that 80% effort, that's what matters. You don't, and if that looks different for you, if that's a shorter time, by all
Mhm.
means. Yeah, I think just like as a rule of thumb, if your rest is like 50 to I don't know 75% of like what the on was, tailor it. Like that's just a good rule of thumb. Like you don't want the rest to be longer than the
Yeah.
on, but yeah, I'd say half to 75%. So you can adjust as long as you maintain that ratio.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of those things like, hey, maybe it's really hot out, so you make the rest longer, right? Especially if,
Absolutely. Yeah.
you know, really gross and humid, make that recovery a little bit longer. Work with the context that you're in. And Logan, I think you came back to a point that Brian said really well last week. Brian had a great segment on if you run at all, you're a runner. Like you are out there doing it, you are training for it. Call yourself a runner. you deserve to give yourself that label, that respect. And so if you're running, welcome, you are a runner. And, I think it's really great for people in the community to hear that from, high quality marathon runners like yourself. And so I do really appreciate coming back to that, Logan. Brian, do you have any last thoughts about interval runs before I kind of turn you loose on our next topic?
No, I think we've really covered the topic pretty thoroughly.
Okay. Well, Brian has been chomping at the bit to talk about our next one. And I promise to those of you that are unfamiliar with this term, I am saying this correctly. This is the real word, this is the real label. And I have a feeling that Brian is going to explain some of the background and the context of it. And so the next type of workout that we're going to talk about is, and let me say this clearly, a fartlek. Brian, go.
So as a historian, I'm really excited to discuss the sort of background of this term. So I'll take us back about a century. So in 1920s, Scandinavian runners were the best runners in the world. A Finnish runner named Paavo Nurmi set, I think, 22 world records, won 12 Olympic medals over the course of the 1920s. So again, runners from Scandinavia were absolutely dominant. And there was also a lot of competition within Scandinavia. So Swedish runners were really eager to beat their Finnish rivals. And so in the 1930s, a Swedish coach developed this idea of fartlek, or sort of speed play, as a way of providing both strength and speed in the same run. And so the basic idea is that it's a continuous run where your paces are sort of constantly varying. So you'll have some easy periods, then you throw in a sort of hard effort, and there's not a whole lot of structure to this. If you're doing, say, a 30-minute fartlek, you might do 2 minutes fast, and then 3 minutes kind of easier, and then 4 minutes fast. There's not a whole lot of structure. And the early, again, sort of 1930s version of this was often done out in nature, in trails through the woods, or, along the beach, or, it's sort of meant to sort of be out in nature. Again, the distance doesn't really matter so much as the effort. And like I said, the idea here is that you're building up both strength and speed in the same run. And it had pretty immediate success. Swedish runners were really dominant in the 30s and 40s, set all sorts of world records. Gunder Haig, a Swedish runner, was the first man to break 14 minutes in the 5K, and also brought the mile world record all the way down to 4 minutes and 1 second in the early 1940s. So that sort of shows you the success that this sort of revolutionary technique had. And I think, again, the history is fascinating, but I think it also is a really useful tool today, again, to sort of bring an element of fun. Sometimes these workouts can get really, we can sort of over-structure things, and sometimes it can feel a little bit daunting if gosh, I've got to do, all of the, whatever it is, like 5 by, 4 minutes, that can feel a little daunting. So sometimes knowing that you've got this slightly less structured run that's going to, again, meant to be a little bit fun, can provide a sort of mental boost as you're training.
Yeah. So I'm going to just admit right off the bat, one, Brian far exceeded my own knowledge about this. I did have in my notes mentioning that fartlek was Swedish for speed play, but I did not have nearly the knowledge to kind of give background and context for that. So I do want to thank Brian for that. It's actually really cool to see that historically this really paid off for a particular group of runners. Logan, for you, we've talked about, hey, maybe our workouts are happening over varying terrain and stuff like that. What do you see as kind of the benefit of the fartlek type workout when, hey, maybe I'm not on a track, or I'm not running on a flat trail and things like that?
Yeah, if it makes you feel better, I did not know it was Swedish until maybe an hour before this podcast, when I decided, hey, maybe I'll do some research, pop open Wikipedia. I always thought it was spelled like it sounds. It took me like years of hearing that term before I realized it wasn't spelled that way. And I always just thought, didn't think about it too hard, but I thought, yeah, that's about like what I would call that. Like, that's the way I felt at the end of it, fartlek.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the great thing, I mean, talk about like bite-sized chunks, like you can do anything for 30 seconds. So like, if you're just doing a 30-second like on and then 30-second off, 30-second on, 30-second off, like it is kind of great to be like, 3 seconds in, be like, okay, I'm almost done. Like 27 more seconds. And yeah, it can be done anywhere. That's, I mean, beautiful thing about this sport to begin with, you can run anywhere. Uh, and this workout especially, you don't need a track. You can do it on the same terrain that you're doing your easy runs on. Just, keep clicking that watch, start on, and yeah, speed up, slow down. And yeah, it's very, very customizable.
Yeah, when we were in college, I think we did most of our fartleks at cow pasture, which ironically I don't remember ever seeing a single cow out there. But it was kind of this up and down, kind of grassy area. It wasn't the most even terrain. It was not designed for us to run fast. Like you weren't gonna run fast mile splits or extended intervals on this terrain, but you were getting good hard efforts. And so, Logan, I'm gonna come right back to you before we go back over to Brian. If you kind of had to guess, like, what relative effort are you going to put the fartlek at?
Probably 8 or 9. Like it's going to be faster than interval. And yeah, I think you are approaching like 8 or 9 territory. Almost, I think like mile pace even is kind of a good rule of thumb for like what kind of speeds you want to be hitting when you're on.
Yeah. Brian, do you want to talk about maybe kind of the length of intervals that you would do here? And then maybe like, hey, this might vary a little bit. Like pace might actually change a little bit depending on the interval, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the great things about this is I think you can adapt it for the distance that you're trying to run. So if you are training for a 5K, I think the fartleks that you use can look different than if you're training for, a half marathon or a marathon. Maybe if you're thinking 5K, you go for slightly shorter on sections where you're going faster. And yeah, maybe it's, 30 seconds on, but you're really pushing those 30 seconds. Whereas if you're training for, again, more like a 10K or a half marathon, maybe the on segments are more like 3, 4, 5 minutes, maybe even a little longer. Although I personally wouldn't go too much more than that. But they're going to be a little bit slower because you're running for longer. So again, I think it can look different. Again, it's
Yeah.
it's sort of an intentionally vague, sort of broad category. But I think the general principle of varying your paces has a lot of benefits.
Yeah. What do you find challenging about that, Brian?
I think the challenging thing can be sometimes again, you can sort of overcomplicate it. So the general idea is that it's just meant to, again, kind of get this injection of pace where, okay, now I'm going to be running faster and I'm going to be running slower. And I do think it's good to be a little intentional with that. You don't want your on sections to become basically your normal pace, right? So you're going to need to be intentional about being on. But yeah, I think personally try not to overcomplicate it and be like, oh my gosh, I have to hit this pace, otherwise it's not, going to be a good effort. Um, so yeah, I think just, for me personally, and again, Logan as a former coach might disagree here, but just that general principle of if you're getting in a good effort where you're mixing in some hard and some easy paces, that I think is still really worthwhile for this particular effort.
Yeah. Logan, what do you find, maybe challenging but also rewarding about this style of workout?
As a simpleton, I have a hard time keeping track of how many I've done. It's easy to be like, all right, I'm doing mile repeats. I've done 3 of them, so I have like 2 more or whatever. But when you're doing these over and over and over, all of a sudden you're like, how long have I been out here? Like the sun's beating down on me. I'm losing track. Are we on? Are we off? But yeah, I think this is the best weapon I have against on my crusade against time. Like this is a purely workout where it's just putting in the effort and then resting, putting in the effort and resting. You're not gonna even be able to like really even pay attention to how fast you're going, right? Like you're just purely feeling out your body, like knowing what it's like to go turn it on and turn it off, change those gears. That's the great thing about it.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on both of those points that you had there. So I did a workout in this style I think 2 weeks ago, and I was just doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, right? And so I'm going to start with the like, oh my goodness, what rep am I on? Thankfully, I know that I kind of struggle with the math. Don't ask me too much about why I struggle with math or what that entails for me on a day-to-day basis. But I was like, how many have I done? And then you talk about you're not even really going to notice or be able to figure out how fast you're going. I would finish the 30 seconds and then I would get into my jog, and my watch is like still going down on what it thinks my pace is. So like I would finish the rep and it would say like, oh, 440 pace. And then like for 5 more seconds, it continues going down to like 420 pace. And I'm like, well, I know I'm not running a 420. It's like your watch can't keep up with some of these changes, which I do agree. Like there's definitely times where I am all in on the crusade against time. And I think this is a good example. And so, I had that as well. Would you all in general suggest staying away from flat ground and tracks and kind of easy to gauge terrain on this? Or do you think, hey, all is fair play, do this wherever you want, whatever's going to make you have fun?
Yeah, I personally would say trying to avoid a track or, a flat trail is beneficial. Again, this was meant to be through the woods but I think getting into something, you're running in a field, you're running on kind of a hillier road, just throwing in these variables where you're not necessarily going to know exactly what that time means is beneficial. Because if you know, well, this is how far I should run in a minute, that's going to
Mhm.
affect how you run. Whereas if you're just running over a field and there are all sorts of hills or turns or whatever, I mean, the the distance is kind of meaningless, and so then it really can just become about the time.
Yeah. And I think Ryan, so one of the other guests last week, not Brian, mentioned like, hey, run in the woods where you don't really know. And you can just be out there and you can enjoy it. I think that would be a great setting for this as well. Logan, where are you gonna go if you have a fartlek session?
Yeah, I love that we're telling our audience to go touch grass, to go take a hike. I love it. Yeah, I also will do the part like kind of the same areas I might do a tempo. So like maybe like a bike path or like a trail with a lot of like packed dirt or something, like some rolling hills. Yeah, like it's that stuff helps. It builds up your muscles. But I don't want to discourage anyone if you have a track nearby and you're a first time runner. Great place to start. Do what's available to you. I love doing workouts on the track because you can bring your phone and your water bottle, have it handy if you need it, and just like, go around the track, and especially like getting into it. Like, make it as easy as possible for you if you're trying to get into running. Like a flat surface is great. And then when you're ready, yeah, like beautiful thing about this sport is spending all this time in the great outdoors. So go out
Mhm.
there, find the hills, find the woods.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And so the last thing that I want to do here before I give the two of you a little bit of an open mic is the goal today was, to me, in my mind, these are kind of the three easiest access type of workouts. These are by no means going to encapsulate all the running workouts in the distance world, all the different workouts or variations that you could do. But I think these are kind of the three easy access. Now, we're talking about fine tuning our engine, right? So we have this wonderful engine that we've been building with our easy running. There's almost this idea that, hey, if I do too much, I could blow the whole thing up. And I don't want to do that. And so I want to go category by category, and we'll go all the way back to where we started with tempo. I have down here that in general, I don't want to do more than about 10% of my weekly mileage at tempo pace in a given week. First reactions, does that seem right? Does that seem appropriate? Does that seem in line with what you do? And we'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we're thinking in general about this sort of 80-20 principle, that, roughly 80% of your mileage should be pretty easy, then I think if, 10% is tempo, I think yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Logan?
I think that makes sense. Maybe hitting like 3 to 4 miles for a 30 to 40 mile week for tempo. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then so let's go to interval. How much time would you want to spend at interval or that 2 mile effort or in that zone where we're really pushing kind of that maximum range, that maximum capacity? Let's start with Logan.
See, now you're making me do math. I think I would never I would do intervals the same amount as I would do a tempo. I think I would have one tempo workout for a week. Like I think I never do more than 2 or 3 workouts in a week. So I'd say a tempo maybe like a Tuesday and an interval on like a Thursday or Saturday, for example. I'm struggling here to think of what percentage of my miles it would be, but I
Yeah.
do think maybe that 10 to 20, but please correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong.
Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. And to build on what Logan said, yeah, I think 2 workouts a week, I think is plenty, especially if you're also doing a long run, which adds its own form of stress. If you're, an elite level college runner, a professional runner, maybe an elite high school runner, maybe you'd need more, but yeah, I think for the large majority of runners, if you're doing 2 workouts a week, that's plenty. And so, yeah, I would say if one of those runs is a tempo run and then one is, an interval or a fartlek, I personally think that's plenty.
Yeah. I think so too. I mean, I really don't want to do more than 2 workouts in a week. Personally, I consider long run and, we didn't talk about long run. I almost am gonna have that be its own episode because there's so much that goes into long run. But to me, long run is what I would call a quality day. I think 8 to 10% on interval, right? Or at that 2-mile effort. For me, that's really a matter of time where that's a very specific stress that we're putting on our heart and our system. And that's hey, I don't want to spend too much time with my heart work and my body working at that effort. And that kind of naturally scales a little bit that hey, as you're faster, you're probably running more miles, like you can handle a little bit more. But for me it's like a time thing and so, for example, if I was building an interval workout, I wouldn't ever really get to or exceed 20 minutes at that interval pace. And like a common workout we did a lot was 6 times by 3 minutes hard, 2 minutes off, right? Gets you to that 18. And honestly, like even our really top runners, like by reps 5 and 6, it's like, okay, yeah, we're really finding our limit here. And, these were guys like Logan that are running under 15:30 in the 5K, which if you're in that crowd, hats off to you, but that is elite rare air. And so, I think that's a good gauge. And Brian, you said kind of the same range for fartlek. Logan, I think you said the same range for fartlek. I think that one is you're maybe going to feel that a little more muscularly than some of the others because it tends to be faster. What are maybe some cues to you all that hey, it's time to cut that fartlek short?
I would say if the on sections feel like they're really slowing down. I mean, again, you're probably not going to know exactly how fast you're going because conditions vary. But if all of a sudden you just feel like, hey, I'm running this a lot slower, maybe give yourself one more. Like okay, you had one bad rep, that's fine. If your second one is also pretty slow, that's probably a sign that you sort of reached what your body can do for that workout.
Yeah, Logan.
Yeah, I think if the ons and the offs start to blend and they kind of look very similar, that's a good sign that maybe it's time to take a break. And there's no shame in that. I adjust my workouts on the fly all the time. Maybe you're just not feeling it that day. Maybe the weather's really bad. Maybe you take a longer rest,
Mm.
and then you see if you got one more in you or two more. Maybe that's all you needed is to chug some water, take some deep breaths, and then you're back on pace.
I think that tails into one of my other cues that if we're really trying to make sure that we're doing this at the right effort, not only, keep the on and off sections from blending, but if I notice that I'm like consistently having to drag out the recovery to get the same effort, that probably tells me, hey, I'm kind of near done, or hey, maybe I'm actually overrunning the on section. I think as important as it is to keep the hard section honest, it's also important to keep the off section honest in the recovery portion honest. I think that's really important as well. Now, a lot of this, and I'll admit because of my background, is not as focused on marathons. And so I do want to give the two of you an opportunity to, we talked about these as kind of the 3 easy access points for running workouts. What is kind of an essential type of workout for marathon training that we should maybe give some floor time to? And I'll let Brian kick this one off.
Well, it's really simple, but for me, I find it really valuable just getting in a lot of miles at marathon pace, which, is gonna be a little bit slower than tempo pace. Like I said, you should be doing some work faster than that. That way marathon pace doesn't feel like your limit. But if you're training and you wanna run lots of, 360s or 7 minutes or 7:30s,
Mhm.
on the day of your marathon, I think putting in a lot of work at that pace. So one of my favorite workouts to do, is like 2 by 8 miles at marathon pace, which is one of those that feels really daunting. Like when I go into it, I'm I'm a little scared of it. But the thing about marathon pace is it should feel quote unquote easy for a long time. And so I found that you sort of hit that 8 mile mark right as you're like, okay, it's getting hard, and you get a break and you sort of jump into it. So that's one of the ones that I really love doing. But
Mhm.
I also think that's one you need to sort of work into. This is your first, very first marathon. Don't try that. Don't try that workout right away.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's do this. I haven't run a marathon. I don't currently have plans to run a marathon. However, I have no idea what I would target as marathon pace. How does someone that is doing that for the first time, how do they pick that? Like, how do they know, hey, I need to start doing marathon pace work? How do I even know what that is?
Yeah, that's tough to say because the marathon is so daunting. This was a race that when you're running it for the first time, or this is my experience, like I had no idea what time I was gonna hit. I was like, maybe I'll hit 3 hours and 30 minutes. Maybe I'll hit 2 hours and 50 minutes or something. Like you don't know because so many things can happen after mile 20. And yeah, so I think this is kind of a race where you think about the goal more. Like if you really want to do 3 hours and 30 minutes sub or sub 3 hours, like it's kind of like working backwards. This, yeah, then, you'll find out over the course of the training whether that's feasible or not. But I do think this is kind of one of those cases where you see, like, okay, what would that marathon pace be to get that
Mhm.
time? Let me try that on my next long run. Yeah, Brian kind of alluded to this, but I do think of a long run as a workout. And I like what you said, Jack, about it being a quality day. I think it's a great way to look at it. I do kind of throw it in as like a half or like a full workout if I'm
Mhm.
counting like the workouts for the week. And then like, yeah, a great workout for that is I do something similar. I do like 10 miles at marathon pace. That's coming in like kind of the tail end training. So I'll do like a 2 mile warm up, 10 miles at marathon pace, which, yeah, sounds daunting. But if you can do that, like that's the closest simulation you're going to get without like
Mhm.
completely, breaking something. And then I'll do like 2 miles cool down. So, yeah, that's just a great way to test it. Like that's the kind of like the last chance I think you really get to see like, is that feasible? And then adjust.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It's as Logan said, it's really hard to know at first. I mean, I think the best way to know is to run one.
Yeah.
um, where I would say is think about your tempo pace and think about your easy pace, and marathon pace should be somewhere in between. In my case personally, it ended up being almost halfway in between, but it might not be for everyone. Um, but yeah, what I would say is sort of use that as a guideline. So think about those two paces, think about what halfway in between that would look like for you, and then see what that feels like on a run and then sort of test that out. Like I said, the thing about marathon pace is it should feel quote unquote easy for a really long time. So if you're running it and you do, again, 4, 5, 6 miles and you're thinking, oh yeah, like this feels pretty good. Like I feel like I could run this,
Mhm.
for a long time. That might be a pretty good indication that that's your marathon pace.
All right. Well, that's maybe giving me a little bit more hope that maybe I would be faster in the marathon than I might think.
I
But
think so.
we'll just kind of leave that to the imagination. We no need to find it out with a test. I still feel like I have lots to do and accomplish in the 5K, 8K, and 10K realm, especially considering I PR'd my 8K in the middle of a 10K earlier this year. So clearly I haven't found the limit there.
No, Jack, see, this is what you do to get engagement up. If you get a million subscribers, you have to run a marathon. You got to get on the Patreon to unlock his marathon training. Yeah, you got to start getting that content up, buddy. You got to start hooking them in, make them punish you. That's how you get subscribers. Just
I'll,
my advice.
I'll tell you what, there is kind of a threshold for kind of weekly returning listeners and engagement where I am going to start doing that kind of thing. Where for, a certain number of likes or listens, I will attempt certain types of workouts and record part of it. But I think we are a long way off of there. And honestly, that might even discourage some of you from some of the engagement of you don't want to see me do that. So we'll see how that plays out. I I really appreciate the two of you coming on. I feel like we got a lot of really good discussion.
Of course.
I really enjoyed Logan, you and I having a little bit different take on interval because I think it kind of tells the audience that look, the philosophies are going to be different. And so what I would say there is if you're leaving this like, oh my goodness, like we're looking at three runners here that maybe disagree, you have to pick a philosophy and stay consistent with that philosophy rather than trying to blend, all right, I'm going to take elements from this one, elements from this one, and elements from a third one and try and make the perfect system. That can get really tricky. That gets really dicey. And so like, I'm not going to sit here and argue with the results that Logan is getting with his effort and his system. And so I think it's important to just like be consistent there. And it looks like you have a thought, Logan.
Yeah, I think that's just kind of my marathon brain seeping in. Like like as we talked and my memory was refreshed, I was like, oh yeah, like intervals used to be 3 minutes, and now for me they're like 6 minimum. I'm just running longer races. It's been a long time since I've run anything an 8K.
Hmm.
So I think that yeah, don't aspire to be like me. Like Brian is saying that he runs his marathon pace is somewhere between tempo and easy, and I was thinking, I think my tempo pace is my marathon pace, but I would not use me as a good judge of character. I should give you a warning against some of my training methods, even if
Yeah.
yeah, they work for me, they're not going to work for everybody.
And
Yeah.
can I build off of that? So again, I think what this whole conversation shows, these are all really important ingredients in a training plan, but it can be so beneficial, especially for a newer runner, to work with a coach who can help sort of put these ingredients together in a coherent
Hmm.
training plan to make you better. And the other thing that I would add is it's so easy these days with Strava and YouTube to see what every other runner is doing, and that can be good in some ways, but it also can be really bad. And so what I
Yeah.
would caution against is do not look at what a professional runner or, a college runner is doing and copy and paste that into your own training plan for many reasons. First of all, very, very few runners on the planet can handle what professional runners are doing. But even if you could, you've got no idea how that one workout that you're seeing on YouTube fits into the larger training plan. So, for
Hmm.
example, they might have built up to that over the course of 10 years of training or even within the season.
Yeah.
Like I said, not every workout is going to be a home run. Not every workout should be a home run. The important thing is just to sort of be consistent week after week, stack these efforts, and let fitness build. The purpose of a workout is not to prove how fit you are; it's to sort of build that fitness over time. And often, when you're seeing a really amazing workout on YouTube, you're seeing the best workout they're going to run every year because that's the one that, they wanted to film. That's not going to be like what your, everyday Thursday workout's going to look like. And that, so just again, finding a coach who can sort of build a structured program for you and then putting faith in that, trusting that your fitness is going to build over time as long as you stick to it. I think that's really key.
Yeah. And again, I'm gonna end on the PhD note there. So Brian, thank you for summing that up for us. I think that was really well said. Find a coach. If you want me and the guests on a particular episode to look at your training plan, give you some thoughts, maybe analyze whatever system might be in play from the coach that you got a plan from, that email will be in the description. Follow. There's an Instagram page, there's YouTube. It's all under the vertical stride. And until then, stay consistent. Happy running.